She was already underground the first time the headlights swept across the barn. She didn't see them. She was 8 feet below the frozen Wyoming soil, lying on a narrow military cot, listening to the wind move across the plains like something ancient and indifferent. The LED light above her cast a warm amber glow across cinder-block walls and shelves lined with canned goods. Her breathing was slow. Her hands, calloused and scarred from 5 months of night labor, rested open at her sides. For the first time in 3 years, Maren Voss was not afraid. She had built that feeling the same way she had built the room around her, methodically, painfully, one shovelful of Montana clay at a time. She had purchased it with bleeding hands and sleepless nights and a particular kind of desperation that only comes to a person who has exhausted every other option and arrived at last at the cold conclusion that no one is coming to save her. She had saved herself instead. But the night she finally slept through without terror, without jolting upright at every creak and whistle of wind, was not the end of her story. It was the last quiet moment before everything she had built was tested against something she had not planned for. This is the story of what Maren Voss survived. All of it. Chicago had been for 6 years the most beautiful trap she ever walked into. She had arrived there at 32, newly established in her career as an interior architect. The kind of woman who could look at an empty room and immediately understand its potential. She had an eye for structure, for the way light moved through space, for the hidden logic underneath surface appearances. It was the quality that made her exceptional at her work. It was also, she would later understand, the quality that Grayson Mercer had recognized in her and deliberately chosen to exploit. They met at a fundraiser for a downtown architectural preservation society. Grayson was 41 at the time, trim and polished with the kind of easy confidence that reads as warmth until you've known someone long enough to understand the difference. He was a senior partner at one of Chicago's most prominent corporate litigation firms. He wore his success quietly, which she found attractive. He asked intelligent questions and listened to her answers with complete attention. On their third date, he told her she was the most interesting person he had encountered in years. She believed him. She had no reason not to. The early years of their marriage were, by any external measure, remarkable. They lived in a beautifully renovated brownstone in Lincoln Park. They traveled to Portugal and to coastal Maine and to the high desert of New Mexico. Grayson was generous and attentive, and Maren's career flourished under the stability of a dual income and a supportive partner. She did not notice at first the slow and deliberate narrowing of her world. It happened so gradually that she would struggle years later to identify a single moment when it began. There was no dramatic confrontation, no obvious line crossed. There was only a long, patient process of subtraction. A friend who stopped calling after Grayson mentioned casually that he found her exhausting. A freelance client who dried up after a reference that Maren never knew about. A sister in Portland who grew distant over months of unreturned calls that Grayson had intercepted on a shared phone plan she hadn't known to question. By the time Maren understood what was happening, her life had been carefully redesigned around a single load-bearing wall, Grayson Mercer. She filed for divorce in the spring 3 years before the night she slept peacefully underground. She did it on a Tuesday morning alone in the office of a family attorney that a colleague had recommended, because she no longer trusted anyone connected to her former life. She signed the papers with a hand that didn't shake, and she felt walking out into the pale April sunlight something close to relief. The relief lasted approximately 72 hours. Grayson did not get angry when the papers were served. This was what she had feared most: an explosion. A confrontation, the kind of scene she could report to police or use in a courtroom. What she had not anticipated was the alternative: that Grayson would simply shift modes. That he would look at the divorce filing the way he looked at a complex case as a problem requiring a strategic solution, and apply to the destruction of her life the same methodical intelligence he brought to every other professional endeavor. Within 2 weeks, her business bank account had been frozen through a civil claim so obscure that her attorney needed 3 days to identify the legal mechanism. Within a month, 2 of her largest clients had quietly ended their contracts. She would learn later from one of them that they had received a call from a senior partner at a prominent firm who had mentioned in passing certain concerns about her professional reliability. Nothing specific enough to be actionable, just enough to plant a seed. Her friendships, already thinned by years of quiet management, evaporated almost entirely. She understood that Grayson was behind it, that he was making calls, sending messages, constructing a narrative in which she was unstable and erratic and not to be trusted. She had no way to prove it. Every avenue she pursued led to the same wall. Grayson Mercer was well-connected, well-regarded, and had spent years carefully building exactly the kind of social capital that could be weaponized against a person who had allowed her own network to atrophy. She obtained a restraining order in July. The judge was sympathetic. The document was real. The ink was dry and the court seal was official. And the order specified in clear legal language that Grayson Mercer was to maintain a distance of 500 feet from her person and her residence at all times. Grayson treated it as a suggestion, not flagrantly, not in ways that were easy to prove. A car she didn't recognize idling at the end of her street for 40 minutes, then gone. A photograph on her social media posted from a restaurant she had visited that she was certain she had not taken. Small things, calculated things. Things that described to a police officer sounded like the anxious overinterpretation of a woman going through a difficult divorce. She installed new locks in August, a deadbolt and a secondary bar lock, and a contact alarm on every window. She began sleeping with her phone on the pillow beside her and a canister of pepper spray on the nightstand. None of it mattered. On the 14th of September, Maren Voss woke at 3 a.m. to find on the pillow beside her phone a single white rose. The stem had been trimmed clean. The petals were perfect and unblemished. It had not been there when she fell asleep at 11. She did not scream. She lay completely still for a long moment, her heart hammering against her sternum, and looked at the rose in the thin gray light from the street lamp outside. Then she picked up her phone and called the police. They came. They took a report. They noted the rose in an evidence bag with the careful, somewhat weary professionalism of officers who had handled this kind of call before. A detective followed up 2 days later with the information that there was no sign of forced entry, that the locks showed no evidence of tampering, and that without clearer evidence of who had left the object there was little they could do beyond noting the incident in the file. Maren sat in her kitchen after the detective left and looked at the wall for a long time. Then she opened her laptop and began searching for property in the least populated regions of the American West. The decision to disappear completely, was not made in a single moment of panic. It was the conclusion of a long, rational process, the kind Maren was trained for. She was an architect. She understood that you did not build a solution without first doing a thorough structural assessment of the problem. The problem was this: Grayson Mercer had resources, connections, and intelligence. He was patient. He was strategic. He would not stop because a piece of paper told him to stop. He would not stop because she moved to another apartment or another neighborhood or another city within the network of places connected to her professional identity. He had already demonstrated that the legal system in its current form would not stop him either. The only solution was to cease to exist, at least as far as Grayson was concerned. She began planning in October. While still in the Chicago apartment, still going through the careful motions of a visible life. She bought a prepaid phone at a gas station 2 suburbs away and used it exclusively for the research she needed to conduct. She opened a new email account on a library computer using a name that was not hers. Her mother had died 4 years earlier, leaving Maren a small collection of jewelry, a sapphire pendant, a strand of graduated pearls, a gold bracelet set with small diamonds. Maren had kept them in a velvet box in her closet, unwilling to wear them and risk losing them. She took them to 3 different estate jewelers in 3 different suburbs, selling each piece for cash, walking away with just over $14,000 folded inside the lining of her coat. She researched the LLC structure in Wyoming, which offered stronger anonymity protections than most states. She found an attorney in Cheyenne who specialized in anonymous land acquisition and conducted their entire business relationship through encrypted email and wire transfer from a new account established under the LLC name. She chose Wyoming specifically because she had no prior connection to the state. No friends, no professional contacts, no thread that Grayson could pull. Hollow Ridge Farm appeared in the listings in late November. 42 acres outside the small town of Kingsford, in a high valley of the Bighorn foothills. The listing was brief. A 2-story farmhouse in fair condition. A large timber barn built in the 1940s. A scattering of outbuildings in various states of repair. The price reflected the property's remoteness and the considerable work it would require. Maren wired the payment through the LLC account in December. She left Chicago on a Tuesday morning in early March, driving a used pickup truck she had purchased for cash from a private seller in Indiana. She took nothing that could be tracked. She left furniture, artwork, most of her clothing. She drove west on I-80 with 2 duffel bags, $14,000 in cash, a prepaid phone, and the particular focused calm of a person who has finally stopped hoping and started executing. She arrived at Hollow Ridge Farm on a Thursday afternoon as the light was failing behind the Bighorn Ridge. The farmhouse was drafty and cold and smelled of old wood and mouse droppings. The barn was enormous and dim, its timber frame solid despite the deteriorating roof, its floor laid with heavy oak planks over a concrete foundation that showed significant cracking along one wall. She stood in the center of the barn that first evening, looking at that cracked foundation in the far corner, where the old horse stalls had been, and she felt for the first time the beginning of an idea. Maren had spent her professional life understanding buildings from the inside out. She knew load paths and drainage and the thermal properties of different insulation materials. She knew how structures breathed and how they failed. She had designed spaces intended to make people feel specific things: openness, intimacy, safety. What she designed for herself at Hollow Ridge Farm was something she had never designed professionally, but had thought about in the abstract, the way architects sometimes think about extreme problems. A space that was genuinely invisible. A sanctuary that existed below the threshold of detection. She began in April when the ground was just soft enough to work. Her cover story, to the minimal extent she interacted with anyone in Kingsford, was straightforward. She was a woman from back east, trying her hand at homesteading, fixing up an old property, keeping to herself. The few people she encountered at the feed supply store and the hardware outlet accepted this without interest. Rural Wyoming had a long tradition of people arriving from somewhere else and wanting to be left alone. The one exception was Orrin Pruitt. Orrin was 68 years old and had operated the Kingsford Building Supply on Route 16 for 31 years. He was a lean, weathered man with hands like old leather and the careful observational habits of someone who had spent 3 decades watching people build things and noting with professional interest what they were actually trying to accomplish. He had white hair cut close to his skull and a tendency to speak in short, declarative sentences with long pauses between them. When Marin came in for her third substantial purchase in as many weeks, buying cinder blocks, heavy-gauge rebar, and 60-pound bags of concrete, mix in quantities that suggested something considerably more ambitious than patching a foundation, Orrin watched her load the truck with an expression of quiet, unassuming attention. "Foundation work?" he asked when she came back to the counter for the invoice. "Back corner of the barn," she said. "It's cracked through." He nodded slowly. "Lot of those old barns, the soil shifts. Ground heaves." He paused. "You need rebar chairs for that pour, to keep the steel off the subgrade." She had already ordered rebar chairs through an online supplier. She knew he knew this was more than foundation repair. She also knew he was not the kind of man to push. "Appreciate that," she said, and paid in cash. He watched her truck pull out of the lot. He filed the observations somewhere in the organized catalog of things he had seen over 31 years of watching people build things, and said nothing to anyone. That detail would matter months later, more than either of them could have known. The excavation took 5 months. Marin worked exclusively at night, beginning after 10 o'clock, when the chance of any passing vehicle was minimal. She had rented an electric jackhammer under the LLC name from a tool supply in Sheridan, 60 miles north, and she used it only during thunderstorms, running it on a long extension cord from the barn's single exterior outlet, while the noise of the storm covered the sound of the hammer. The concrete slab in the far corner of the barn was 6 inches thick and reinforced with old mesh wire that had to be cut away with an angle grinder. Beneath it was Wyoming clay, dense and unyielding, the color of dried rust. She broke it with a mattock and loaded it into heavy canvas contractor bags, hauling them one at a time across the barn floor and out through the side door to her truck. Then driving to the deep drainage ravine at the back of the property, where she dumped them and covered the fresh earth with deadfall from the cottonwood stand. Her hands blistered on the first week and bled on the second. By the third week, the blisters had become calluses thick and hard, and she no longer felt the individual impacts of the mattock. She felt only the accumulated weight of the day's work settling into her shoulders and lower back as she drove back to the farmhouse each night and fell into bed without washing. She cried some nights, not from despair, though despair was sometimes present. She cried from the specific anguish of physical exhaustion, pushed past its reasonable limit. The kind of crying that is not grief, but simply the body's release valve when there is no other option. She allowed it. Then she slept. Then she got up and did it again. By August, she had carved out a space 12 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 8 feet deep. The dimensions were precise because she had calculated them precisely enough volume to maintain survivable air quality for an extended period. Enough floor space for functional furniture and supply storage, small enough that the earth surrounding it would provide effective thermal insulation. She poured the new concrete floor herself, mixing it in a rented drum mixer outside the barn and carrying it in buckets. She set the rebar in a grid pattern and poured it in sections over 3 nights. When it cured, she began building the walls. The cinder blocks went up course by course level, checked with a laser tool she had bought at Oren's store, mortared with the care of someone who understood that this wall would need to be perfect, because there would be no correcting it later. She filled the cores with concrete and threaded additional rebar through the fill for strength. She knew the earth outside those walls would try in time to move inward. She built the walls to resist that pressure for years. The framing and insulation took September. She used spray foam in the wall cavities and rigid foam board on the exterior of the frame walls, achieving an insulation value well above what was required for the expected thermal loads. A licensed electrician in Kingsford would later have estimated, looking at her wiring, that whoever had done it either had professional training or had studied the subject with unusual thoroughness. Marin had spent 3 months reading electrical codes and practicing connections on a training board she built from spare materials. Power came from a bank of 8 deep-cycle marine batteries in a ventilated alcove she built into the east wall. The batteries were charged by 2 flexible solar panels she had mounted horizontally on the barn roof's south face, disguised behind the existing corrugated iron, with a frame that looked from the ground like a patch repair. The charge controller was a commercial unit designed for off-grid installations, rated for considerably more draw than she intended to put on it. The ventilation system was the most complex problem she solved. She needed fresh air exchange that was sufficient for extended occupancy, but could not be visible from above or from either side of the barn. She found the solution in the salvage market, an air filtration unit from a wrecked Class A motorhome, the kind of self-contained system designed to manage air quality in a sealed vehicle. She rebuilt it into the wall framing, running the intake and exhaust through separate PVC pipes that she encased in corrugated metal conduit and routed up the north wall of the barn's exterior, where they terminated in downward curved galvanized caps that she painted with rust inhibitor to match the surrounding surface. From 5 feet away, they were indistinguishable from ordinary drain pipes. She was proud of the ventilation system. It had required 3 design iterations and 2 complete reinstallations, and the final result was, by her own assessment, elegant. She had not imagined the one condition under which it would fail. The entrance was the last thing she built and the thing she spent the most time designing. She had purchased a commercial fire-rated steel door, the kind used in industrial applications, rated to 4 hours of direct flame exposure and capable of withstanding significant impact loads. She mounted it flat over the opening on a custom steel frame set into the concrete at the lip of the excavation, fitted with a heavy-duty hydraulic piston that allowed the combined weight of door and frame to be lifted smoothly from below. She had tested the piston mechanism 40 times before she was satisfied. Over the steel door, she constructed a false floor from reclaimed barn planks. sourcing wood from a demolition project she found listed online, selecting boards that matched the age and weathering of the existing floor, closely enough that the eye would not distinguish them. She distressed the new wood herself with wire brushing and diluted stain working by lamplight in the farmhouse kitchen. The engine block was the final element. She had found it at a salvage yard outside Sheridan, the block from a 1957 Oliver tractor, cast iron, massive 340 pounds. She had the yard loaded onto her truck with a forklift. She had spent 2 days with an angle grinder and a cutting wheel hollowing out its interior cavities to reduce the weight to something she could manage while preserving the external appearance of a solid, immovable piece of agricultural history. She dragged it across the barn floor on a furniture dolly, positioning it directly over the seam between the false floor and the existing planks, and surrounded it with bales of old alfalfa hay from the property's storage. To enter her room, she had to move 3 specific bales in a specific sequence, slide a recessed latch, and activate the hydraulic piston from a hidden switch. The entire sequence took 90 seconds. From above, when the bales were in position and the engine block sat over the seam, the corner looked exactly as it had looked for decades. The abandoned, dusty corner of an old Wyoming barn home, to nothing but rust and old hay and the patient accumulation of time. She completed the room in late November. A military cot with a 4-inch foam mattress, a small chemical toilet behind a partition wall she built from plywood, shelving along the east and west walls, stocked with 340 cans of various foods, 120 liters of bottled water, 2 complete first aid kits, a hand crank emergency radio, a small library of paperback books, and a paper journal with 4 spare pens. On the desk she built from construction lumber, she placed a battery-operated digital clock, a thermometer, and a small audio monitor with a weatherproof microphone she had run up into the barn's rafters on a hair-thin insulated wire. She could hear everything that happened in the barn above without being visible or audible from it. She climbed down the ladder on the last night of November and sat on the edge of her cot and looked at what she had built. It was 12 feet by 10 feet. It smelled of concrete and fresh lumber, and a faint mineral sharpness from the deep cycle batteries. The LED lights gave it the warm, steady glow of a place that had been lived in. It was the safest place she had ever been in her life. She lay down on the cot and pulled the sleeping bag over her shoulders and closed her eyes. The sound of the wind moving across the Wyoming plains was very faint, filtered through 8 feet of earth and concrete. It was almost from this distance a soothing sound, the sound of weather happening at a safe remove. Maren Voss slept for 9 uninterrupted hours. When she woke, she lay for a long time looking at the ceiling and feeling something she had forgotten the texture of. Not happiness exactly, something more fundamental than happiness. The simple physical certainty of being in a place that was genuinely hers, that no one knew about, that she had made with her own hands, that could not be reached by anyone who wished her harm. She had been wrong about that, but she didn't know it yet. December arrived as it always did in the Bighorn foothills, abruptly with total commitment. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 4 days. The sky went the color of old iron and stayed that way, low and featureless, the clouds moving fast from the northwest in a steady, unbroken current. The cottonwood trees along the east fence line dropped their last leaves overnight and stood bare and brittle against the gray horizon. Maren spent the first week of December making the farmhouse ready for winter. She had fixed the wood stove in October, replacing the cracked firebox plate and cleaning the flue, and she had spent 3 weekends in November splitting and stacking wood in the lean-to shed attached to the north wall of the house. She checked the propane tank in order to fill. She weather-stripped the windows and put plastic sheeting over the 2 that had gaps she hadn't gotten to. She was in the strange lexicon of her new life, almost comfortable. She had established the minimal routines of a person making a go of rural life. She drove into Kingsford twice a week for supplies, paying always in cash, exchanging the brief pleasantries of someone who was polite but not interested in connection. She had stopped looking at every passing vehicle with the visceral dread that had characterized her first months. She still noticed every unfamiliar truck, still registered every face she didn't recognize, but the noticing had become background process rather than emergency response. She told herself this was progress. On the morning of December 12th, she woke to the sound of the AM radio station's emergency alert tone. She listened to the forecast sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around a cup of coffee, watching the sky through the window over the sink. The meteorologist's voice was flat and careful in the way that weather professionals get when they are reporting something outside normal parameters. A bomb cyclone forming over the Rockies. Projected landfall in the Bighorn Basin by mid-afternoon. Expected snowfall 40 to 50 inches over 48 hours. Wind gusts to 90 miles per hour. Temperature dropping to -35 Fahrenheit by nightfall and remaining there for 72 hours. Then Sheriff Rudd Calloway came on. Calloway had a voice like dry gravel, worn smooth by 30 years of talking to people in difficult circumstances. He was 61 years old and had been the Kingsford County Sheriff for 11 of them. And when he came on the emergency broadcast to tell people what he was about to tell them, there was no drama in it. Just the flat, serious weight of a man who had seen storms before and was not in the business of understating them. "If you are on the county roads after 1800 hours today," Calloway said, "you are on your own. Emergency services will be suspended until conditions allow safe operation. Hunker down. Stock your firewood. Fill your bathtubs with water in case the pipes freeze. And if you have neighbors who are elderly or alone, check on them now before the storm hits, because you will not be able to check on them after." Maren turned the radio off. She looked out of the window at the sky, which had gone from iron gray to something darker, a bruised purple-black that sat low over the ridgeline and moved with the particular intentionality of weather that has decided on a course of action. She spent the morning carrying additional firewood into the house. She filled the bathtub. She checked the propane. She made a mental inventory of the food in the farmhouse pantry and confirmed she had enough to be comfortable for a week. She looked at the barn. She thought about the room below it. She dismissed the thought. The underground room was her absolute last resort. Her panic room. Her final option in the event of a human threat. She had not built it to shelter from weather and the idea of spending a historic blizzard in a windowless underground box when she had a functional house with a wood stove felt like an overreaction so severe it bordered on self-punishment. She would ride out the storm in the farmhouse. She would be fine. At 2:15 in the afternoon, the first snow began to fall. Maren was at the kitchen sink washing the lunch dishes, looking out the window at the driveway that curved away from the house and ran half a mile to the county road. The snow came in fast and horizontal, driven by a wind that had already picked up to something serious, rattling the window glass and finding every imperfect seal around the frame. She watched the snow accumulate on the driveway. She watched the tree line disappear behind the white. And then she saw the truck. It was at the far end of the driveway, just turning off the county road onto her property. She saw it between one sweep of blowing snow and the next, caught for a moment in a gap in the weather. Black large, moving with the smooth, deliberate authority of something expensive. Not a work truck. Not the kind of vehicle that anyone in Kingsford County drove. A Ford Raptor, black as charcoal, clean as a showroom floor despite the conditions. It stopped at her mailbox. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He was wearing a dark wool overcoat, the kind with a structured shoulder, and a fit that does not come from a rack. He moved to the mailbox with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never been in a situation they did not control. He opened it. He removed a piece of mail. He held it up in the failing afternoon light and read it. Then he smiled. It was a small smile barely visible at half a mile through blowing snow. But Maren knew it. She had seen that smile across a dining table, across a courtroom gallery, across the empty air of an apartment she had been trying to make feel like home. She knew the angle of those shoulders and the particular stillness of that head, and the specific quality of attention that gathered in a man when he had located something he had been looking for. The kettle on the stove began to whistle. Maren did not move. Grayson Mercer looked up from the piece of mail and looked directly at the farmhouse window. The distance between them was enormous. The snow was thick. He could not have seen her. He smiled again anyway. Maren had approximately 5 minutes. The driveway was icy and unpaved and wound through 2 sharp bends before it reached the house. In this weather, with this visibility, even a truck like his would need to move carefully. 5 minutes, maybe 6. She did not panic. This was the thing she had prepared for. This was the exact shape of the nightmare she had rehearsed 1,000 times in the dark, lying on her cot, 8 feet underground, running the sequence in her mind until it was reflex. She moved. The duffel bag came first. She grabbed it from the bedroom closet, yanked it open, and shoved in 3 random items from the top of the dresser. A sweater, a pair of jeans, a single boot without its pair. She left the bag unzipped, upended it partially on the living room floor so that its contents spilled out in a pattern of panicked departure. She knocked a dining chair onto its side with a single precise motion. She went to the kitchen and turned the burner under the kettle to its highest setting, letting the whistle climb to a scream. She grabbed her real coat, her actual boots, the pack she had kept ready for this moment sitting behind the false back panel she had built into the hall closet, a pack containing her cash, her documents, a change of clothing, 2 days of food, a first aid kit, and a handheld GPS unit. She went to the back door and threw it open and let the wind take it, banging it hard against the exterior wall. Then she ran off the back porch into the accumulating snow, which was already 3 inches deep and coming down faster, now driven almost horizontal by the wind. She ran toward the tree line on the east side of the property, letting her boots punch deep, chaotic tracks in the snow, running with the visible urgency of a person who does not know where she is going, only that she has to go. At the tree line out of sight of the driveway, she stopped. She turned. She moved through the trees at a controlled jog parallel to the property line until she was behind the barn. She pressed her back against the north wall and listened. Over the wind, she heard it, the low, powerful growl of the Raptor's engine, the crunch of tires on the frozen driveway gravel. Then the sound of the engine dying. Then doors. She slid along the north wall to the side entrance of the barn. A narrow door almost invisible under the shadow of the overhang. She went through it without touching the frame. Inside the barn was dark and cold, smelling of old motor oil and dried hay, and the particular dusty emptiness of a space that had housed animals once and did not anymore. The wind pressed against the roof with a sound like something being dragged across metal. She moved to the far corner. Her hands were shaking, but her movements were precise. She knew exactly where the bales were. She shoved the first, then the second, then the third, the alfalfa scratching against her palms. She found the recessed latch beneath the third bale's position and pulled it. She reached for the hydraulic switch. From outside, carried faintly through the barn walls over the rising wind, she heard the back door of the farmhouse banging against the exterior. She heard nothing else. Then she pressed the switch. The hydraulic piston engaged with a soft, almost inaudible hiss. The false floor lifted the engine block, rising with it on its hidden mount. She climbed down the wooden ladder into the dark square of her room. She reached up and found the interior handle and pulled the assembly shut above her. The latch caught. The hydraulic piston held the weight. She found the deadbolt in the dark by feel and drove it home. Then she turned on the light. The warm amber glow of the LED filled the space, the cot, the shelves, the chemical toilet behind its partition, the digital clock on the desk reading 2:27 in the afternoon, the thermometer reading 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Maren stood in the center of her room and breathed. Above her, through 8 feet of Wyoming earth and concrete and steel and reclaimed barnwood, she heard the side door of the barn open. She heard it not because the room wasn't soundproofed, but because she had wired the audio monitor in the rafters and left the receiver on. Through the small speaker on her desk, she heard the slow, deliberate footsteps of Grayson Mercer crossing the barn floor above her head. She reached out and turned the monitor's volume to its lowest functional setting, just enough to hear. The footsteps moved across the barn. They paused. They moved again, tracing a careful perimeter of the space, the old floorboards groaning under the weight of a large man moving with deliberate attention. Then his voice came through the speaker, muffled by earth and steel, reduced to something thin and proximate. At once the voice of a man speaking into a space he believed was empty. Maren. He said her name the way he said everything, with complete certainty, with the absolute assurance of a man who has never needed to doubt that what he was looking for was there to be found. I saw the kettle. The water wasn't even close to boiling. A pause. The footsteps resumed slow and patient. You didn't run into those woods. You're smarter than that. And you've always been smarter than you let on. The footsteps stopped directly above her. Maren looked up at the ceiling. She looked at the exact point on the drywall above her that corresponded as nearly as she could calculate to where Grayson was standing. She stopped breathing. You found something out here, he said. His voice had changed slightly. Still controlled, but with a new quality underneath it. The focused attention of a man who has just noticed something that interests him. The LLC was clever. But Maren, you used the same secondary email address to pay the property taxes that you used for your alumni newsletter subscription back in 2019. I had someone check every property tax record in a 6-state radius. A pause. You were always a little sloppy with routing numbers. Silence. Above her, she heard the heavy, hollow sound of his fist striking the side of the old tractor engine block, once, twice, testing its weight. I know you're here, he said. The question is where? Marin pressed her hand over her mouth. The footsteps resumed moving away from the corner. She heard him try the barn's main doors, heard the winds roar, blast through briefly before the doors shut again. Then, after a long pause, she heard the side door open and close. The audio monitor carried the sound of the storm outside, the rising continuous bellow of wind that had climbed to something well beyond what the forecast had promised. It was getting dark early. The temperature was already falling toward the numbers Calloway had warned about. Marin sat on the edge of her cot, her hands between her knees, and let the adrenaline work its way out of her system. She sat for a long time. The digital clock moved through 3 o'clock and toward 4. She thought about what he had said. The email address. 3 years of careful planning, 3 years of discipline and sacrifice, and what had undone it was a routine tax payment made through an account she had forgotten she'd ever used for anything else. A single thread left dangling from a life she had tried to cut away completely. She thought about this for a while. Then she stopped thinking about it because it didn't matter now. What mattered now was what was above her, and what was outside, and what was coming. Outside, the worst storm in 40 years was organizing itself into something historic. Inside the barn, somewhere above the 8 feet of Wyoming earth that separated her from everything that wanted to harm her, Grayson Mercer was looking for a way in. And Marin Voss, 38 years old, trained in the structural logic of built spaces and the patient mathematics of what holds and what fails, settled into her room and began to wait. She had food for 30 days, water for 30 days, power in the batteries for 2 weeks of careful use, a chemical toilet and a sleeping bag rated to -20 degrees, and a library of paperback novels and a paper journal and 4 good pens. She had built this place to withstand a monster. She had not yet learned that the storm outside would prove a monster of its own. But that was still hours away. For now, in the amber-lit silence of her underground room, Marin Voss breathed slowly and steadily and waited. Above her, Wyoming was disappearing under the snow. Above that, Grayson Mercer was still looking. And above all of it, the sky was doing something that the sky in that part of the world does only once in a generation. It was opening up entirely. The storm hit the Bighorn Basin the way catastrophes always hit, faster than expected, harder than promised, and with a totality that made every prior preparation feel suddenly humiliatingly inadequate. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the visibility outside Hollow Ridge Farm had dropped to 0. Not the soft, romantic 0 of a gentle snowfall. A hard, absolute 0. The kind of white that erases the distinction between ground and sky and makes a person feel they are standing inside a solid object rather than moving through open air. The wind had climbed past 60 miles per hour and was still climbing, and the sound it made against the barn's roof was no longer wind at all. It was something structural, something that pressed down on the timber frame with physical weight and tested every joint and fastener against the accumulated force of a continent of cold air moving at speed. 8 feet below the barn floor, Marin heard none of this directly. She heard it through the audio monitor. The small speaker on her desk translated the storm's violence into a continuous roar of static-edged sound, the crackling interference of extreme weather crossing an unshielded wire. Underneath that roar, the barn's bones spoke in the language of stressed timber, deep, slow groans from the main beams, the sharp complaint of roof purlins flexing against their connections, the irregular percussion of loose, corrugated iron sheeting hammering against the frame above. Maren sat on her cot, with her knees drawn up and her back against the cinder block wall, listening to the building above her try to hold itself together and track the sound of Grayson Mercer. He was in the farmhouse. She could not hear the farmhouse from here, but she knew he was there because the barn was silent of him, and the farmhouse was the only other structure on the property substantial enough to offer shelter. She had listened to him leave through the barn's side door at 3:20, and had heard the wind take the sound of his footsteps within seconds. The Raptor was parked somewhere on the property. He was inside. She allowed herself to consider this without the full weight of terror, the way she had learned over 3 years to handle information about Grayson at a slight remove analytically, as a set of variables rather than a personal assault. He was in her farmhouse. He had access to her wood stove, her food stores, her wool blankets. He was warm and sheltered and would remain so until the storm passed, at which point, if she had not emerged, he would return to the barn with more time and more determination and begin a systematic search that would eventually, she had to acknowledge, locate the seam in the false floor. This was the problem. She turned it over in her mind, examining it from different angles. The way she examined a structural problem in a building, looking for the load path, looking for where the force was actually traveling and where it could be redirected. The storm was her ally in one sense. As long as it raged at the intensity Calloway had described, Grayson was as trapped here as she was. He could not drive out. He could not call for help in any way that would not simultaneously expose what he had done following a woman to a remote property under a restraining order. Grayson Mercer, for all his resources and connections, was not a man who called law enforcement on himself. So they would wait together, separated by 8 feet of earth and 200 feet of horizontal distance, and whoever endured longer would determine what happened next. Maren believed she would endure longer. She had built this room for exactly this duration. She had food and water and power and a toilet. She had everything Grayson did not. She opened her journal and began to write. The pen moved across the paper in her careful architect's hand, recording the time, the temperature inside the room, the weather conditions as best she could assess them, and the last known position of Grayson Mercer. She wrote it the way she had been trained to document a project, factually precisely without emotional editorializing, a record that could be read later and understood. She wrote for 2 hours. The clock on the desk moved through 5 and 6. The ambient temperature in the room held at 52 degrees, warmed by her body heat and the extraordinary insulation of 8 feet of earth. She ate half a can of black beans cold from the can, drank a measured 8 ounces of water, and turned off the LED light to conserve the battery bank. In the dark, the audio monitor continued its steady translation of the storm. At 9:47 in the evening, the headache arrived. It came first as a dull, symmetrical pressure at the base of her skull, the kind that might have been fatigue or tension, or the particular discomfort of a person who had spent several hours in a state of controlled fear. Maren noted it without alarm and assumed it was the latter. She shifted on the cot, adjusted the pillow, and tried to sleep. By 11 o'clock, the pressure had migrated forward and deepened, settling behind her eyes with the specific throbbing quality of a headache that had decided to stay. She turned the light on and drank another 4 ounces of water, wondering if she was dehydrated. She ate 2 crackers from the open sleeve on the shelf. By 1 in the morning, the nausea arrived. It came with a wave of heat across the back of her neck, followed immediately by a rolling oceanic unsteadiness that had nothing to do with motion. She sat up sharply on the cot, and the room swam. She gripped the edge of the mattress. The LED light seemed both too bright and somehow insufficient, as though it was failing to illuminate things properly, as though the edges of her vision were softening without her permission. She looked at the thermometer. 51 degrees. Normal. She looked at the clock. 1:17 in the morning. She looked at the ventilation intake on the east wall. The neatly capped PVC pipe that represented the terminus of the system she had spent 3 design iterations perfecting, and she felt the first cold finger of genuine alarm touch the back of her throat. The air filtration unit drew outside air through the intake pipe on the barn's exterior north wall, circulated it through the filter medium, and exhausted the room air through a separate pipe on the same wall. The system had been designed for this room's volume and her occupancy level, and it had functioned perfectly in testing. There was no reason for it to fail. She stood up. The room tilted. She put a hand on the shelving unit for stability and stood with her eyes closed for a moment, waiting for the inner ear to agree with the floor's assessment of what was horizontal. Then she understood. The intake pipe terminated on the exterior of the barn's north wall. The exhaust pipe terminated 18 inches away. Both pipes ended in downward curved galvanized caps designed to shed water. She had designed them to shed water. Rain moving vertically or at an angle, falling and draining away. She had not designed them for 4 feet of horizontal hurricane-force snow. The blizzard had been driving snow almost parallel to the ground for 9 hours. The north wall of the barn was a broad, flat surface directly perpendicular to the prevailing wind direction. The curved caps effective against rain and moderate snow were filling from below, as the driven snow packed itself upward into the opening with the density of something being forced under pressure. The insulation value of the room she had built with such care was now working against her, sealing the space so effectively that as the packed snow gradually blocked the intake and exhaust, the air inside had nowhere to exchange. The CO2 was rising. She was breathing her own exhalations in an increasingly closed loop. The headache, the nausea, the visual softening at the edges, these were not tension or dehydration. These were the clinical signs of hypercapnia, the specific and progressive poisoning of a person by the carbon dioxide their own body was producing. She had researched this. She had read about it extensively during the design phase of the ventilation system, in the same careful, thorough way. She read about everything she built. She had read the progression: headache, nausea, visual disturbance, increasing confusion, and then a seamless transition into unconsciousness that arrived not as a dramatic collapse, but as a gradual darkening, like a light being slowly turned down, until the person simply did not wake up. She had time. She was not sure how much. She moved to the east wall. During construction, in a moment of thoroughness she had almost skipped, because it had seemed overly cautious. Even by her standards, she had installed a threaded clean-out cap at eye level on the intake pipe, where it passed through the interior drywall. The cap gave access to the pipe's interior in case of blockage. She had imagined installing it a bird's nest or a fall of debris. She had not imagined this. She reached for the cap. Her hands were not cooperating fully. The motor coordination required to grip the heavy plastic cap and apply rotational force was somehow more demanding than it should have been, as though the signal from her brain was arriving at her hands, slightly delayed, slightly attenuated. She wrapped both hands around the cap and twisted. It did not move. The temperature differential between the heated interior air and the frozen pipe had created a contraction in the threads, binding them with the particular stubbornness of cold metal that has been sitting in one position for an extended period. Marin twisted harder. The cap held. She stopped, breathed focused. She pulled her wool sweater off over her head and wrapped it around the cap, giving her palms better purchase against the plastic. She positioned her feet against the wall below the pipe and put her body weight into the motion, leaning away from the wall with the sweater-wrapped cap gripped in both hands, using herself as a counterweight. The threads gave, not gradually. They released all at once with a sharp, sudden hiss of pressure. Differential, the cap spinning free in her hands, and the sweater unraveling as she stumbled backward 2 steps. She caught the shelving unit again, found her feet and breathed. From the open pipe came nothing. No air movement. The snow had packed so densely into the exterior vent that the pipe was effectively sealed at both ends, the cap's removal having relieved the internal pressure. Without restoring any airflow, she needed to clear the exterior blockage from the inside. She had a chimney sweep rod. She had bought it for the farmhouse, a flexible fiberglass rod in sections that could be assembled to reach through a flue. And she had brought one set of sections down into the room during outfitting because she had thought in her characteristically thorough way that it might be useful for clearing debris from the vent pipe if it ever became necessary. She assembled 3 sections with hands that were moving more slowly than she needed them to move, the connectors requiring more coordination than they had required the dozen times she had practiced this in normal conditions. She fed the assembled rod into the open pipe and pushed. The rod traveled 8 feet through the horizontal run inside the wall, then turned upward into the vertical exterior section. She fed more rod in feeling the resistance build as it climbed. At 10 feet, the rod met solid resistance, not the soft resistance of loose snow. The dense, concrete-like resistance of snow that had been driven by 90-mile-per-hour wind into a confined space and compressed to something near the density of ice. She pulled the rod back 6 inches and drove it forward. The blockage did not move. She pulled back further and drove it forward harder, putting her shoulder into it. The rod bowed at the connection point, and she backed off, afraid of snapping it. A broken rod lodged in the intake pipe would be a problem she could not solve from where she was. The visual disturbance at the edges of her vision had progressed. The room was not spinning exactly. It was doing something more subtle and more alarming. It was losing its crispness. The edges of the shelving units, the clean lines of the cinder block joints, the precise angles of the room she had built with such care were softening slightly, as though she were looking at them through a lens that was very slightly out of focus. She knew what this meant. She pulled back the rod until she had maximum extension within the pipe, without risk of overflex set. Her feet gripped the rod at the lowest point she could reach and drove it upward with everything she had. Her vision went to gray at the periphery on the impact. She drove it again and again. On the 4th thrust, she felt something change in the resistance. Not a release, not yet. a shift, a suggestion that the mass blocking the pipe was not entirely monolithic, that there was structure within it that could be disrupted. She drove the rod a fifth time, screaming through her clenched teeth. With the effort, the sound swallowed entirely by the insulated walls. The scream not of despair, but of the specific focused fury of a person who has come too far to lose to a pipe full of snow. The blockage released, not gradually. It released with the sudden decisive collapse of a structure that has been holding under load and finally reaches its limit. A massive chunk of compressed snow dropped through the pipe and erupted from the open interior cap in a cold white spill across the concrete floor, followed by an immediate, violent inrush of air at -35 degrees Fahrenheit that hit Marin's face and bare arms and neck like something liquid rather than gaseous cold, so extreme it registered in the nervous system, not as temperature, but as pain. She fell backward onto the floor. The air hit her open lungs, and the shock of the temperature differential made her gasp, which drove more of the freezing air deeper, which made her gasp again. She lay on the concrete with the frozen air pouring over her, and gasped like a person pulled from water, because that was functionally what was happening. She was being pulled from water. The CO2 that had been slowly drowning her was being displaced by the most unpleasant but thoroughly adequate air she had ever breathed in her life. The gray at the edges of her vision began to recede. She lay on the floor for 4 minutes. She counted them on the ceiling, watching the LED lights' edges sharpen back to their proper geometry, watching the room return to its actual dimensions. The cold was extreme. The air from the pipe, unfiltered now that the cap was off, carried the full violence of the storm's temperature directly into the room, and she was lying directly in its path, in a thin, long-sleeved shirt. And she did not care. Oxygen. She pulled herself up, eventually found the clean-out cap on the floor, checked the threads. They were intact. She screwed the cap back onto the pipe, closing off the stream of Arctic air and returning the ventilation system to its filtered airflow operation, now that the exterior blockage had been cleared. The room temperature would recover. The CO2 would not rebuild until the intake blocked again, and she did not believe it would block again with the same ferocity, because she had cleared a channel through the compacted snow that would take time to reseal. She sat on the edge of the cot, wrapped the sleeping bag around her shoulders, and let herself shake. She shook for a long time. The shaking was not fear, though fear was present. It was the body's accounting the involuntary settling of a system that has been pushed beyond its operating range and is now recalibrating. She let it run its course without fighting it. When it was done, she picked up her journal from the desk and wrote the time, 2:41 in the morning. And then she wrote ventilation failure. Resolved. Note for future vent caps. Inadequate for sustained horizontal wind-driven snow. Design revision required. She held the pen for a moment after writing this. Then, in spite of everything, she almost smiled. Design revision required. As though there would be a future iteration. As though this were a project with subsequent phases. She put the journal down and lay back on the cot and closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but she rested. At 6:22 in the morning, the audio monitor came back to life. It had been cycling through static for hours, the storm's electromagnetic interference reducing its output to near uselessness. What Marin heard when the static briefly cleared was not wind and timber. It was the barn doors, The main doors, the large sliding doors on the barn's south face, that she never used the ones that faced the driveway in the farmhouse. She heard the groaning of their rollers, the high-pitched shriek of metal on metal, as something or someone forced them against the pressure of the wind, and then the deep concussive thud of them shutting again, cutting the storm's roar to a muffled bellow. Then breathing. She heard it clearly through the monitor amplified by the microphone she had placed in the rafters. Ragged breathing, not the steady, controlled respiration of a man moving deliberately through a space he owns. Breathing that had been damaged by cold that was working too hard, that carried in its irregular rhythm the specific distress of a body that has been exposed to conditions outside its tolerance for too long. Grayson, not the Grayson who had stood at her mailbox in his tailored overcoat and smiled at the confirmation of her address. Something had happened to that version of him during the night. God damn it. His voice through the speaker was unrecognizable as the smooth, measured instrument she remembered from 6 years of marriage and 3 years of fear. The syllables were broken by the uncontrollable percussion of teeth that could not stop chattering. The arrogance was gone from it. What remained was something raw, or something that a man like Grayson Mercer presumably spent considerable professional energy ensuring no one ever heard. Fear. Actual fear. Maren sat completely still on her cot. The sleeping bag around her shoulders, the audio monitor at its lowest audible volume. She listened. She heard him moving through the barn, his footsteps less deliberate than they had been the previous afternoon. He was moving with urgency without the patient, methodical quality of a search. He was not looking for her in the same way he had been looking for her before. She heard him pulling things. The clatter of metal, the hollow crash of something striking the floor. He was moving objects, and she understood with the slow comprehension of someone who had been awake for nearly 20 hours and nearly asphyxiated in the intervening time what must have happened. The farmhouse wood stove. She had replaced the firebox plate and cleaned the flue in October. But the stove was old, and the damper control was a corroded iron handle that required specific knowledge and specific pressure to operate correctly. She had learned its particular mechanism over 3 weeks of daily use. It had a way of sticking that could fool a person into thinking the flue was open when it was partially closed. And if you loaded a stove with wood and lit it, and the flue was not fully open, the smoke had nowhere to go. Grayson Mercer had spent 6 years in a luxury high-rise, and before that in faculty housing at Northwestern, and before that in a succession of well-maintained apartments. He had, as far as she knew, never operated a wood stove in his life. He had almost certainly loaded her stove with wood in the middle of the coldest night in 40 years, and lit it without properly opening the flue, and smoked himself out of her farmhouse, or worse, if the smoke had backed up sufficiently and he had added more wood trying to compensate, and if a spark had caught the dry wood paneling that lined the farmhouse living room wall. She did not feel sorry for him. She noted this with a kind of distant clinical interest. The absence of pity, where pity might theoretically have lived. 3 years of systematic destruction had apparently been sufficient to eliminate whatever reserves of sympathy she had once held for him. She felt nothing for his difficulty except a grim private satisfaction that felt very much like justice. He was continuing to move objects above her. The wet, ragged quality of his breathing was audible even through the storm noise. He was very cold. Hypothermia moves in stages, and what she was hearing suggested he was somewhere in the moderate range past the shivering that the body uses to generate heat, and into the deeper cold that affects motor coordination and judgment. Then he stopped. Abby. He called a name that was not hers. A name he had used sometimes in the marriage when he was trying to make her feel like someone smaller than she was. She had asked him not to. He had never stopped. His voice was coming from directly above her. She could feel the correspondence in her bones, a subtle sense of mass and proximity that was not sound exactly, but was related to sound. He was standing on the false floor, over the engine block, over her. I know you're under here. The chattering of his teeth was audible between words, now involuntary and continuous. The house is gone. The power's been out since midnight. I know you have a room down here somewhere. I know you wouldn't have bought all that concrete and rebar just to patch a foundation. Marin did not move. I'm not angry. The words came out on a breath that was more vapor than voice. Marin, I'm not angry. It's 40 below outside. The wind took part of the roof. I need to get inside somewhere warm, or I'm gonna die out here. And I need you to understand that. The audio monitor carried every word with crystalline fidelity. She said nothing. She made no sound. She heard the scraping of the engine block on the floor above. He had found it. He had understood with whatever remained of his considerable intelligence, after a night of cold and smoke and desperation, that the hollowed engine block was not simply a piece of abandoned machinery. He was pushing against it. The engine block weighed, after she had removed the interior material, approximately 180 pounds. Grayson, at his best and warmest and most composed, was a man of perhaps 190. At whatever physical state he had reached after a night in an unheated farmhouse and the walk across the property in negative 35-degree wind, he would have lost significant muscular coordination to the cold. But he had adrenaline, and he had the particular terrible energy of a man who has identified his only option and has nothing left to lose. The engine block moved. She heard it in the floor above her, the deep grinding complaint of cast iron being forced across oak planking. An inch, then another, then a longer scrape as he committed his full weight to it, grunting with the effort a sound she had never heard from him before. A sound stripped of all the professional polish and social engineering, and it was in its raw desperation almost human. I see it. His voice was climbing in pitch, the teeth chattering giving way to something more frantic. I see the seams. I found you. A pause in which she could hear him breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. Open the door, Marin. Open the door right now. The sledgehammer. She heard it before she fully processed where he had gotten it. The 10-pound sled she kept near the workbench for breaking up old concrete. He had found it in his search of the barn. The first blow came down on the false floor above her steel hatch. The reclaimed barnwood, which looked authentic and original because it was old and authentic and original, had never been designed to withstand impact loads. It shattered under the sledgehammer with a crack that transmitted through the earth and concrete into the room below as something less than a sound and more than a vibration. A physical impact registered by the bones of her feet through the concrete floor. The wood splintered away from the steel beneath it on the second blow. On the third, the steel surface was exposed, and she heard the hammer strike the plate directly. The sound was extraordinary. a deep, resonant clang that hit a frequency she felt in her back teeth, and the cavity behind her sternum enormous and close and immediate. The hatch shuddered against its frame, a slight but perceptible tremor that confirmed the kinetic force being applied from above. The deadbolt held. She had set the deadbolt into a steel frame that she had welded to the hatch plate and anchored into the surrounding concrete with chemical anchors rated for industrial loads. A 10-pound sledgehammer applied by a man in advancing hypothermia was not close to the force required to dislodge it. She knew this. She had calculated it. She had over-engineered it by a factor of 4, because she was the kind of person who did not believe in engineering to the minimum required specification. When the consequence of failure was her life, the blows continued, regular, slowing the intervals between them, lengthening as the muscles driving them fatigued. Grayson Mercer had been a moderately athletic man in his 40s whose physical fitness had been maintained by a personal trainer in a climate-controlled gym. He had spent the night without adequate heat or sleep. He was hypothermic. He was hitting a piece of industrial steel with a tool he had never used before in conditions he had never imagined encountering. The deadbolt did not move. Marin. The hammer blows stopped. What came through the monitor now was something she had genuinely never heard from him in 6 years of marriage. Crying. Not the performative emotional display he had occasionally deployed in mediation sessions to suggest that he was the injured party in this situation. Real crying, involuntary and undignified, torn out of him by the cold and the exhaustion and the dawning comprehension that the elegant strategic move he had planned so carefully had arrived at an outcome he had not modeled. Marin, please. His voice was very thin now, very young somehow, stripped of its instrument quality. My hands. I can't feel my hands anymore. I know what I did. I know everything I did. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it. Just open the door. Please just open the door, and we can figure out the rest later. Marin sat on her cot with her hands folded in her lap. She looked at the audio monitor on the desk. The small black speaker with its grid of perforations transmitting with perfect fidelity the sounds of a man who had spent 3 years dismantling her life and had arrived at the end of his resources at a steel door she had built and a deadbolt she had set, asking her to undo in a moment what she had spent 5 months constructing. She looked at the monitor for a long time. Then she reached out and turned it off. The room went quiet. Not entirely quiet. The storm was still audible through the earth as a low, continuous presence. A sub-bass frequency that she felt more than heard. But the human sounds were gone. The crying, the begging, the hammer that had been growing slower with every blow. Marin sat in the quiet. Above her, through 8 feet of earth, a man was dying by degrees in a Wyoming blizzard. She understood this. She held it in her mind without flinching. He had traveled to her property with a plan. He had timed his arrival to coincide with the most isolating weather event in 40 years. He had found her address through 3 years of sustained methodical investigation and had driven 1,800 miles to exercise in the most remote and unwitnessed location. He could arrange whatever he had come to do. She did not open the door. She lay back on her cot and pulled the sleeping bag over her shoulders and looked at the amber glow of the LED light above her and listened to the storm. At 3:47 in the morning, she felt it before she heard it. The vibration came through the concrete floor. First, a long, resonant tremor that registered in the small bones of her feet as something massive was moving above her. Then, the sound arrived, not the sharp crack of the sledgehammer, not the groan of a single beam or fastener, something more total. The deep, catastrophic voice of a large structure reaching the end of its load-bearing capacity all at once. The roof of the 1940s timber barn had been carrying 800 square feet of framing and corrugated iron for 80 years. For the last 12 hours, it had been carrying the additional weight of 4 feet of wet, heavy snow, deposited by the worst storm in living memory. Pressed down by 90-mile-per-hour winds that created uplift forces and lateral loads that no timber structure of that age and maintenance history was designed to resist simultaneously. The main ridge beam, a 12-inch by 14-inch section of Douglas fir that had been bearing the load patiently since the Truman administration, had been giving for hours in ways that expressed themselves as slow, ominous deflection. Anyone watching it would have seen it happening. No one was watching. The ridge beam failed at its center. The failure was not gradual. When a structural element of that scale reaches its ultimate capacity, the release is instantaneous. The ridge beam snapped, and the roof folded inward along its centerline, taking the secondary framing with it, and the entire assembly, timber and iron and 4 feet of compacted snow, came down into the interior of the barn in a single enormous, simultaneous collapse that generated a shockwave through the ground that Maren felt as a physical blow to her body through the concrete she was lying on. The sound was beyond anything she had a category for. It was not a bang or a crash. It was a detonation. The concussive force of tens of thousands of pounds arriving at their final resting position in approximately 1 second, accompanied by the secondary sounds of everything breaking that was capable of breaking timber iron. The old horse stall framing the workbench, the toolboxes, the rusted equipment she had never gotten around to removing. The audio monitor, which she had turned off, would have captured none of this. It didn't matter. The sound came through 8 feet of earth and concrete as clearly as though the wall between them did not exist. Then, silence. A silence so complete and so immediate after the detonation that it had a physical quality of its own, like the silence after a very loud noise in a very small room. The storm was still out there. She could still feel its sub-bass frequency in the concrete, but the barn was no longer producing any sound at all. The sledgehammer had not struck the hatch in at least 20 minutes before the collapse. Maren lay on her cot in the silence and looked at the ceiling of her room. She looked at the fire-rated steel hatch, 6 inches of steel and concrete above the crown of her head, and assessed its condition. It had not moved. The frame had not shifted. The concrete surrounding it showed no new cracks. Whatever had come down above her had come down in a quantity and configuration that the hatch built to industrial specifications and set into concrete had absorbed without compromise. She was intact. She reached out and turned the audio monitor back on. Static. Not the storm interference static of before. A different quality of static, the static of a microphone that is operating normally in a space that contains no sound of human origin. Maren turned the monitor back off. She sat up on her cot and put her feet on the concrete floor and sat in the amber light for a long time, her hands open on her knees, her breathing slow and even. Then, she reached for the hydraulic lift control, not to open the hatch. She had no intention of opening the hatch tonight or for any night. She could hear the storm's violence above her. She activated the piston for exactly 2 seconds, just long enough to feel the resistance to know how much weight was pressing down on the assembly from above. The motor strained immediately, not the smooth, confident engagement she had tested 40 times. A labored, high-pitched whine of a mechanism working against a load it had not been designed for. She released the button. Above her, thousands of pounds of collapsed timber and wet snow, and the iron roof of a 1940s Wyoming barn sat across her exit. The hydraulic system, which could have lifted the hatch against 2 people standing on it, could not lift the structural skeleton of an entire building. She was inside. The hatch held. The room was intact. She was also, as of this moment, completely sealed underground. Maren Voss sat on the edge of her military cot and did the only calculation that mattered now. She had food for approximately 30 days. Water for approximately 30 days. The battery bank used conservatively would power the essential systems for approximately 14 days. The ventilation was functional for now. The temperature in the room was survivable. She was 38 years old. She was a trained architect with a thorough understanding of structural systems and material properties and the behavior of buildings under load. She had planned meticulously for a human threat and had survived it. She had survived the ventilation failure. She had survived the psychological pressure of lying 8 feet underground while a sledgehammer struck the steel above her. She reached for her journal. She opened it to a new page. She wrote the date and time at the top. Then she wrote in her careful hand, "Roof collapse confirmed. Exit blocked. Hydraulic lift insufficient against current debris load. Situation contained and survivable. Duration of current supplies 30 days. Estimated time to rescue or recovery unknown." She underlined the last word. Then she put the pen down. Outside, the worst storm in 40 years continued its work across the Wyoming plains, burying the black Ford Raptor under an 8-foot drift, stripping the remaining shingles from the ruins of the farmhouse, bending the power line poles along Route 16 until 3 of them snapped. In Kingsford, Sheriff Rudd Calloway sat in his office drinking his 4th cup of coffee and watching the emergency dispatch board, which was showing 3 stranded motorists, a structure fire on the south end of town, and a complete absence of operational roads in any direction. He would not be able to move a vehicle for at least 48 hours. He did not know yet about Hollow Ridge Farm. He had no reason to. In the underground room below the collapsed barn, Maren turned off the LED light and lay in absolute darkness and listened to the storm finish what it had started. She was alive. That was the fact she returned to again and again in the darkness. She was alive and she was warm enough and she had food and she had water. And she had outlasted the monster who had come for her. What she did not yet know was how long outlasting him was going to require. 30 days felt manageable. 89 felt like something else entirely. But the night of December 13th was not the time for that calculation. The night of December 13th was simply the time to breathe and conserve the battery and let the storm do what it was gonna do and be alive inside the room she had built, with her own hands at the cost of 5 months of bleeding work, and the absolute last reserves of a person who had decided somewhere between a white rose on a pillow and a foreclosed property listing in Wyoming that she was going to survive. She had survived. For now, that was enough. The first thing Marin did on the morning of December 14th was count her supplies, not because she didn't know what she had. She had inventoried the room during construction with the precision of someone who understood that survival arithmetic was not the kind of math you wanted to do in a hurry. She knew exactly what was on every shelf. She counted anyway because the act of counting was a form of control, and control was the only currency she had left. 312 cans of food, 119 liters of bottled water in 2-liter containers, 48 protein bars, 6 pounds of dried fruit in sealed bags, 4 pounds of mixed nuts, 2 complete first aid kits with sufficient antibiotics for a course of treatment, 8 spare batteries for the flashlight, 4 spare pens, 1 journal 3/4 empty. She wrote the inventory in the journal with the date at the top. Then she sat down on the edge of her cot and did the calculation she had been putting off since the moment she had pressed the hydraulic lift button and heard the motor strain against an immovable load. 30 days of food at normal consumption. Less than that at the consumption level of a person under physical and psychological stress, which she was. More than that if she rationed aggressively, which she would. She settled on a working estimate of 40 days at strict rationing before the food became a genuine emergency. Water was the harder constraint. 119 liters for one person at minimum hydration in a cool environment. 60 days perhaps. Perhaps less if the ventilation system required her to exert herself. The batteries were the real problem. At her current usage rate running the LED lights and the audio monitor and the ventilation system's small blower motor, the battery bank would last 12 to 14 days. After that, she would have the flashlight. After the flashlight batteries ran out, she would have darkness. She turned off the LED light immediately. In the dark, with only the faint amber glow of the digital clock's display to orient her, she sat and listened to the silence of a room buried under a collapsed building in the aftermath of a historic blizzard. And she thought about what she was going to do with the next 30 to 60 days of her life. She was going to stay alive. That was what she was going to do. The specific mechanisms of staying alive were secondary to the primary commitment which she made to herself in the dark on the morning of December 14th, with the same deliberate professional finality with which she signed contracts and approved construction drawings. She was going to stay alive. Everything else was implementation detail. She instituted the rationing protocol immediately. 1 can of food per day, alternating between higher calorie options and lower calorie options to manage the psychological experience of eating, as well as the physical one. 8 ounces of water in the morning, 8 ounces in the evening, 4 ounces with the food. The LED lights off except for the 30 minutes before sleep, when she allowed herself to read or write in the journal. The audio monitor off entirely, its small power draw not worth the return now that the barn above was silent. Movement was carefully managed. She had 10 feet by 12 feet of concrete floor, and she used it. She walked laps in the dark, counting them, reaching from wall to wall, with her hands at first. And then, as her body learned the room's geometry by repetition, walking without touching, she did push-ups and sit-ups, and the stretching routines she remembered from a yoga class she had attended 6 years ago, before Grayson had suggested gently and persistently that the studio made her unavailable on the evenings he preferred to have dinner with colleagues. In the first 2 weeks, she was fine. This is the word she used in her journal deliberately as a daily assessment. Fine. Not good, not comfortable, not at peace with her situation. Fine, functional, maintaining. She wrote the word each morning after recording the date, the temperature inside the room, her estimated water consumption, and a brief physical status report. The journal was her instrument panel, and she was the aircraft, and as long as the instruments were reading within normal parameters, she was by definition fine. She was meticulous about the date count. December 14th was day 1. She scratched a mark in the journal for each passing day, and she did not allow herself any ambiguity about which day it was. Uncertainty about time was the first step toward the dissolution of the mental framework she needed to keep intact, and she was not going to permit it. She thought about Orrin Pruitt sometimes in those first 2 weeks. She thought about the expression on his face when she had bought the cinder blocks and the rebar, the way his eyes had tracked the quantities without comment, and the way he had offered the information about rebar chairs not as interference, but as the quiet professional courtesy of a man who respected competent work and wanted to see it done correctly. She thought about whether he would notice she was gone, whether anyone would notice she was gone. She was a woman who had, by design, made herself unnoticeable. The qualities that had protected her were now working against her in a way she had not fully anticipated when she had built them. She had built a life that could disappear without trace. She had succeeded. On day 8, she allowed herself to think about Grayson. She thought about him with the same analytical remove she had applied to every other aspect of her situation, because analytical remove was her tool, and she was not going to put it down simply because the subject was difficult. She thought about the specific sequence of decisions that had led a man of his intelligence and resources to arrive at the outcome of dying in a collapsed barn in Wyoming in December, frozen and alone, having spent his last functional hours begging through a steel door. She concluded that arrogance had been the mechanism, not stupidity. Grayson was not stupid. He was a man who had spent 20 years being the most capable person in every room he entered, and this had eventually produced in him a blind spot so large that he had walked directly into it. He had planned for every variable except the one in which the person he was pursuing was more capable than he was. He had never modeled that scenario because he had never genuinely believed it was possible. He had been wrong. She wrote this in the journal. She wrote it plainly, without satisfaction and without grief. Then she closed the journal and turned off the flashlight and lay in the dark and let herself feel whatever she actually felt, because the journal was for facts and the dark was for everything else. What she felt was complicated. There was relief so profound it was almost indistinguishable from grief, the way extreme cold can feel like burning. There was exhaustion that went deeper than physical. There was something she could only describe as a kind of vast, hollow quiet, where 3 years of fear had been a space that had not yet figured out what it was going to become. She lay in that space for a long time. Then she slept. Day 15 arrived like a change in weather. Nothing happened on day 15. The temperature in the room was its usual 50 degrees. The water supply was tracking within her projected consumption rate. The food supply was adequate. The batteries were performing as expected. By every objective measure, day 15 was identical to day 8 and day 3 and day 1. But something had shifted in the quality of the dark. Myron had been a person comfortable with solitude. She had always worked better alone, thought more clearly without the ambient noise of other people's needs and expectations pressing against the edges of her attention. Solitude had been in the years before Grayson something she sought deliberately. During the marriage, it had become a luxury. During the 3 years after the marriage, it had become a survival strategy. But this was not solitude. This was something more absolute. Solitude implied the possibility of company, the option of other people available but not chosen. What she was experiencing in the room below the collapsed barn was the total absence of that option. There was no one to hear her if she spoke. There was no surface in this room that reflected any information about the world beyond it. There was only the room and the dark and the sound of her own breathing and the slow ticking of the digital clock. On day 15, she started talking. Not to herself exactly. She talked to her mother. Her mother, Elaine Voss, had died 4 years ago of a cardiac event that arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning while she was making breakfast. She had been 63 years old and in apparently reasonable health, and the shock of losing her had been the particular devastating shock of a loss that arrives with no preparation time. Maren had grieved her thoroughly and had reached in the 2 years before fleeing Chicago, a relationship with that grief that was mostly peaceful. In the dark of the underground room, she talked to her as though she were present. She did not believe her mother was present. She was not experiencing a psychotic break or a spiritual visitation. She was a pragmatic woman who understood that what she was doing was using a mental construct to create the experience of dialogue because the human nervous system is not designed for this quality of isolation, and was beginning in subtle ways to register its objection. She told her mother about the room. She described the construction in detail, which her mother, a retired schoolteacher with no engineering background, would not have understood, but which Maren found comforting to describe because describing it reminded her of what she had accomplished. She told her about Wyoming in the fall, the way the light moved across the Bighorn Ridge in the late afternoon with a quality she had never seen in Chicago or anywhere else she had lived, horizontal and golden and ancient feeling. She told her about Orrin Pruitt and his leather hands and his economy of speech. Her mother, in Maren's reconstruction of her, was characteristically practical. She asked about the water supply. She asked whether Maren was eating enough protein. She expressed a mild but genuine concern about the temperature and suggested that Maren keep her socks on at all times because her circulation had never been good. Maren kept her socks on. Day 23. She woke from a dream she could not remember and lay in the dark for a long time before she was certain she was awake. This was new. The boundary between sleep and waking had been clean and reliable until now. Its blurring was a sign she noted in the journal without alarm, but with attention. The dream had left a residue. Not imagery or narrative, but a feeling, a sense of presence in the room. Some quality of the air that suggested recent occupation by something other than herself. She lay still and listened. The ventilation system's small blower, the faint subsonic presence of wind above muffled through earth and debris. The clock. Nothing else. She got up, did her walking laps in the dark, did her push-ups. She ate her morning ration. She drank her morning water. She wrote in the journal. Day 23. Temperature 49 degrees. Water on track. Food on track. Batteries at approximately 40%. physical status functional, mental status maintaining. She held the pen over the page for a moment after writing this. Then she added dreams becoming present, monitor. She was honest with herself in the journal. It was the one place she permitted complete honesty because the journal was her instrument panel. And an instrument panel that reads false is worse than no instrument panel at all. Days passed. January arrived, and she knew it only because her count said so. January had no distinguishable character from late December in this room. The temperature varied by 2 degrees over the course of any given day, warmer when she was active, cooler when she slept. The food diminished with the slow, reliable pace of a metered process. The water diminished slightly faster than she had projected, which she adjusted for. On day 28, she turned on the LED light for a full hour in the middle of the day, using the battery draw she had been saving for this specific purpose. She had saved it because she had a task that required full illumination. She reorganized the food shelves by caloric density, placing the highest calorie cans at the front and the lowest at the back, restructuring her rationing protocol to optimize caloric intake per liter of water consumed. This took 40 minutes. She allowed herself the remaining 20 minutes to read. She had brought 12 paperback books into the room during the outfitting phase, chosen for length and density rather than preference. She was on the fourth, a thick historical novel set in 19th century Montana that she had picked up at the Kingsford General Store without particular expectation, and had found in these circumstances to be the most absorbing thing she had ever read in her life. She read for 20 minutes with the focused, grateful attention of a person for whom 20 minutes of reading is an event rather than a habit. Then she turned the light off and sat with the after-image of the words on her retinas until they faded and the dark returned. Day 34. The battery bank reached 20%. She calculated she had approximately 4 days of minimal usage remaining before the essential systems would begin to fail. The ventilation blower was the critical load. Without it, the CO2 would begin to build again. She had cleared the exterior vent blockage on the night of the storm, and the freeze-thaw cycling of the intervening weeks had likely prevented the same compaction from reforming. But the blower was what maintained the positive air exchange that kept the room breathable. She disconnected the LED light entirely. She disconnected the audio monitor. She reduced the blower to its lowest functional speed, the setting she had tested during construction, as the minimum that maintained adequate air exchange at her occupancy level. Her world became the flashlight, and the clock and the blower's small, steady hum in the dark. She had read all 12 books. She started reading them again from the beginning. The psychological deterioration when it came did not announce itself. This was the thing she had not fully accounted for in her preparation. Not because she hadn't thought about it, but because thinking about it and experiencing it were different things in the way that reading about cold and being cold are different things. It came as a gradual porousness of the membrane between what had happened and what she was imagining. In the first weeks, her thoughts had been organized and sequential, moving from one item to the next, with the professional efficiency of a mind trained to manage complex projects. In the 6th and 7th weeks, the organization became less reliable. Thoughts arrived without her summoning them. Memories presented themselves with the vividness of current experience, not as hallucinations. She was clear about this distinction and maintained it carefully, but as memories so fully rendered that they temporarily displaced the present. She remembered with olfactory clarity, so complete it was almost physical. The smell of her mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings, coffee, and the specific brand of dish soap her mother had used since before Marin was born. Toast, the particular warmth of a house that was lived in and loved. She remembered less welcomely the smell of the Chicago apartment after Grayson had begun his campaign. The way it had stopped smelling like a home and started smelling like a place she was enduring. Stale air and the floral chemical of the cleaning products she had used obsessively in the months before she fled, as though cleanliness could substitute for safety. She did not let herself stay in the bad memories. She had a technique for this developed over 3 years of PTSD management. Without professional support, she named what she was experiencing, labeled it precisely in language, and then redirected to a physical sensation in the present moment. The weight of the sleeping bag, the texture of the concrete floor through her socks, the temperature of the air from the ventilation blower on the back of her hand. I am here. I am in this room. I am alive. She said it aloud sometimes when the memories were particularly vivid. Her own voice in the dark was strange to her. It had the quality of something being used after a long period of disuse. A little rough, a little uncertain of its own authority. But it was her voice, and it was real, and it located her in the present when the present required locating. She was maintaining. She wrote this in the journal each morning, and she meant it each morning. And she understood that the meaning of the word was shifting. That maintaining in week 8 meant something different from maintaining in week 1, but that the commitment behind it remained constant. She was going to stay alive. That had not changed. Day 51. The food supply reached its critical threshold. She had enough remaining for approximately 22 days at current rations, which she had already reduced twice from the initial protocol. She was consuming approximately 800 calories per day. A woman of her size and activity level required roughly twice that for normal function. The deficit was accumulating in her body in ways she could measure the looseness of her clothing. The time it took to rise from lying down, the slight tremor in her hands during fine motor tasks. She was not starving, but she was moving in that direction at a pace that had become measurable. She reduced her daily movement routine. The walking laps and the push-ups and the stretching had been essential for mental health and had cost calories she had been willing to spend. She could no longer afford to spend them. She moved once in the morning 10 slow laps of the room with her hands on the walls, and once in the evening and otherwise remained on the cot. The stillness was its own challenge. The body deprived of movement generates a specific kind of restlessness that has to be managed deliberately. She managed it by working through the structural details of every significant project she had ever designed, reconstructing them in her mind with the full 3-dimensional precision of professional spatial memory. She walked through rooms she had made. She remembered the decisions she had made and why the load-bearing walls and the light sources and the proportions that created the feeling she had been hired to create. She was good at her work. She had always known this. But in the dark, reconstructing her professional life from memory, she understood it with a new completeness. She had made spaces that were genuinely beautiful. She had understood before Grayson how to make a room feel safe. She had lost that understanding for 3 years and had spent 5 months getting it back by building it herself underground by hand. She was going to make more rooms after this. She was going to go back to her work, and she was going to make spaces that were beautiful and safe, and she was going to understand them when she made them from the inside out in a way she had not understood before. This was not a fantasy. It was a plan. She held it in her mind with the same deliberate commitment with which she held the daily ration count and the water tracking and the battery monitoring. It was data. It was the most important data she had. Day 67. The flashlight batteries died. She had known they would. She had 2 spare sets and had swapped them in sequence, monitoring the output quality as the indicator of remaining charge. When the second spare set faded to the faint yellowish glow that meant they had 15 minutes remaining, she used those 15 minutes to locate by touch the items she would need immediate access to. In total darkness, the water container, the food shelf, the journal with its pen clipped to the cover, the digital clock. Then the flashlight went out. The room went dark in a way that was qualitatively different from the darkness she had been managing for weeks. The clock display, a soft blue-green, remained. That small rectangle of light 2 inches by 1 inch became her entire visual world. She could read the time. That was what she had. The time and the blower's hum and the dark. She lay on the cot and breathed. She was 67 days underground. She had enough food for perhaps 15 more days at current rations. She had enough water for slightly longer. The ventilation was functional. The temperature was survivable. She was alive. She said it to the dark. She said it with the flat, declarative commitment of a woman who has used the word alive for so many days as a daily minimum standard that it has become something more than a condition. It had become a practice, a discipline, a choice made each morning when the clock showed a new day, and she chose to record it rather than ignore it. Alive. Day 67, still here. Day 78. She heard something. She had been lying on the cot in what she now thought of as her resting state. Not asleep, not precisely awake, occupying a middle territory of reduced metabolic demand that her body had developed as an adaptation to the caloric deficit. The blower hummed. The clock showed 4:43 in the morning. She heard something, not in the room. From outside, it transmitted through the walls in the way that sounds could be felt, rather than heard through sufficient mass, not as airborne waves, but as structure-borne vibration. A rhythm, slow and deep and mechanical. She pressed her ear against the cinder block wall and felt it more clearly. A pulse. Regular, heavy, unmistakably powered. A diesel engine, large and working under load, operating somewhere not far above her. She pulled away from the wall. She pressed her ear back against it. The rhythm was real. She was not imagining it. Her hand on the block confirmed what her ear reported, a faint but unmistakable vibration at the frequency of heavy machinery. Someone was moving equipment above her. She sat up. She had been moving carefully for 2 weeks to avoid unnecessary caloric expenditure, but she stood up now and crossed the room to the hydraulic lift control without thinking about calories at all. Orrin Pruitt had mentioned the woman to Sheriff Rudd Calloway on the 28th of February. He had been thinking about mentioning it for 3 weeks. He was not a man who involved himself in other people's business without cause, and he had spent considerable time determining whether he had cause. He concluded that he did when the county road crew reported that Hollow Ridge Farm's driveway which should have been plowed by its occupant at some point during the weeks following the storm, had not been touched since the blizzard. The driveway was invisible under 4 feet of undisturbed snow. He drove to the sheriff's office on a Tuesday morning and sat across the desk from Rudd Calloway and told him about the woman who had bought cinder blocks and rebar and concrete mix in quantities that didn't match any reasonable foundation repair project, and who had paid cash for everything, and who had been coming into the store for 8 months and had now not been seen since before the December storm. Calloway listened without interrupting. When Orrin finished, the sheriff sat for a moment in the way he had of sitting when he was moving things around in his mind. "Description," Calloway said. Orrin described her. 30-something, medium height, dark hair, usually back, careful eyes, moved like someone who was paying attention to her surroundings, always polite, never forthcoming. Calloway wrote it down. What did she say the construction was for? Foundation repair, back corner of the barn. You believe her? Orrin looked at him. I sold her enough rebar and block for a foundation repair and about 3 other things besides. Calloway drove out to Hollow Ridge Farm the next day with a deputy and a county-owned snowcat that could manage the unplowed driveway. They found the ruins of the farmhouse first. The roof collapsed inward, the walls standing but compromised the interior. A frozen catastrophe of smoke damage and snow intrusion. The wood stove they could see through the broken front window was in a state consistent with severe misuse. They found the Ford Raptor on the 3rd pass, with the snowcat buried under a drift against the east fence line, its black roof barely visible. The plates came back to a Daniel Grayson Mercer of Chicago, Illinois, reported missing by his law firm on December 19th. When he had failed to return from what colleagues described as an unspecified personal trip. Calloway stood in the cold outside the buried truck and looked at the wreckage of the barn. What had been a large timber structure was now a low mound of snow, with the irregular silhouette of collapsed framing visible at its edges. He looked at it for a long time. He called for a backhoe from the county yard. They found Grayson Mercer on the 2nd day of excavation, preserved by the cold with a completeness that the medical examiner would later describe as remarkable. He was in the corner of the collapsed barn. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of blunt force trauma from the ridge beam and hypothermia, with the forensic evidence suggesting hypothermia had been well advanced before the collapse. He had been carrying a 10-pound sledgehammer, the steel plate visible beneath the debris its surface showing the impact marks of repeated blows, told a part of the story that Calloway spent several hours reconstructing in his mind before he fully understood what he was looking at. The other part of the story he understood when his deputy found the LLC registration for Hollow Ridge Farm in the county records and cross-referenced it with a restraining order filed in Cook County, Illinois 3 years prior. Calloway stood in the excavated ruin of the barn and looked at the steel plate and the concrete frame surrounding it and the cinder block walls visible in the excavation below. And he understood with the particular clarity of a man who has spent 30 years reading scenes exactly what this woman had built, and exactly why. He did not know if she was alive. He brought in cadaver dogs. They were working the debris field at the south end of the excavation, moving through the material the backhoe had cleared when the ground moved, not settled, not shifted. Moved with the specific intentional quality of a mechanical system engaging. The steel plate rose, a fraction of an inch, then stopped, then shuddered and rose again, pushing against the remaining debris above it with a desperate straining effort that Calloway recognized immediately as something fighting to get out. He shouted at the backhoe operator. The bucket came down and swept the remaining debris from the plate in 2 passes, and Calloway was on his knees at the edge of the excavation before the dust settled and the plate rose fully on its hydraulic hinge and revealed the dark rectangle of the opening below, and a hand came up from the dark and found the concrete edge and gripped it. Maren Voss pulled herself out of the earth. She came up slowly, the way something emerges that has been compressed and is not yet certain the compression has ended. Her arms were thin under her layers of clothing. Her face was the color of the concrete she climbed out of, pale with a grayish undertone that the medical team would later catalog as consistent with prolonged malnutrition and vitamin deficiency. Her eyes, when they found the light, went through a visible adjustment, the pupils contracting the focus, shifting from the near infinite distance she had been seeing in the dark to the concrete reality of a Wyoming morning in early March. She looked at Calloway. He was on his knees 2 feet from her, his breath making clouds in the cold air. His expression carefully composed in the way of a man who has learned not to put his reactions onto the people he is trying to help. Behind her, the dark room she had lived in for 89 days was visible, the military cot, the empty shelves, the chemical toilet, the digital clock still blinking on the desk, the blower still running, the room she had built with her hands underground that had kept her alive. She sat on the edge of the opening and let the March sun hit her face. It was not dramatic what she felt. She had expected something larger, something commensurate with 89 days. What she felt was simpler and more total than drama. She felt the sun on her skin. She felt the cold air in her lungs, clean and vast, and carrying the particular smell of Wyoming in the early thaw snowmelt and frozen earth beginning to release, and the distant thin scent of pine from the ridge. She felt the concrete under her hands. She felt the size of the sky, which was enormous in the way that Wyoming skies are always enormous, and which, after 89 days of 8-foot ceilings and total dark, was almost more than she could take in at once. She sat with it. She let it be as large as it was. Calloway's deputy was on the radio calling for medical. Behind him, 2 other officers stood at a distance, giving her space with the instinctive courtesy of people who recognize they are witnessing something that belongs entirely to the person at its center. Calloway stayed where he was. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He understood in the way that 30 years of reading people had given him the capacity to understand that what this woman needed in this moment was not assistance or words or the organized intervention of emergency services. She needed 60 seconds of sky. He gave her 60 seconds. Then gently, "Ma'am, are you Maren Voss?" "Bah, Sarpa." She turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were dark and clear, and had in them something he would describe later in his report simply as composed. Not the composed of a person suppressing something, the composed of a person who has already done the suppressing over a long period of time and has arrived at a genuine stillness. She looked past him for a moment, at the black body bag resting near the equipment at the south end of the excavation. She looked at it with an expression that contained nothing he could categorize as grief or triumph or relief. She simply looked at it. Then she looked away, back to the sky. I am, she said. Her voice was rough from disuse, the words slightly effortful like a door opened on hinges that need oiling. She cleared her throat. Marin Voss. Calloway nodded. He reached into his coat pocket and came out with a silver emergency blanket, the kind every rural sheriff's vehicle carried, and he held it out to her without unfolding it, letting her decide what to do with it. She took it with both hands. She unfolded it slowly and drew it around her shoulders. The medics are coming, he said. They'll be here in about 10 minutes. Is there anything you need right now? She considered this with the seriousness of someone who has learned not to answer questions carelessly. Water, she said. Warm if you have it. He had a thermos of coffee in the vehicle. He sent the deputy for it. She held the thermos in both hands and drank it slowly in small sips, with the focused attention of a person who has forgotten that warmth was a thing a person could simply have. The medical team arrived and she submitted to their assessment, with patience and without drama, answering their questions, factually wincing at the blood pressure cuff, without complaint accepting the IV line in her arm, with the equanimity of someone to whom discomfort had recently been recalibrated. They loaded her onto the stretcher with more care than was strictly necessary, understanding without being told that they were handling something that had been through a great deal and had held together through all of it. Calloway rode with her to the hospital. He sat across from her in the ambulance, and she lay on the stretcher with the blanket over her and looked at the ceiling. And after a while she spoke. The LLC documents, she said, and the restraining order from Cook County. You found them. We did, he said. He was operating under a sustained violation, she said. He had been since the order was issued. There will be a record of it if someone looks. Someone will look, Calloway said. She turned her head and looked at him. I want to make a statement. When I'm able. You take the time you need. I'll be there when you're ready. She looked back at the ceiling. 3 years, she said, not as a complaint, as a statement of duration. As the kind of fact you record in a journal, this is how long it was. This is the number. I know, Calloway said. She was quiet for a while after that. The ambulance moved through the Wyoming morning, and outside the windows, the snow was retreating from the fields in patches. The brown grass beginning to show through in the places where the angle of the sun hit longest and hardest. The slow and inevitable return of the world to its growing season. In Chicago over the following weeks, investigators working from the statement Marin gave would spend 3 months unwinding the financial and legal architecture of what Grayson Mercer had built. They found the accounts he had used to freeze her assets. They found the correspondence with the private investigators he had employed. They found the network of professional relationships through which he had systematically poisoned her reputation. The carefully worded calls and emails that had been designed to read as concern while functioning as demolition. They found the tracking software he had installed on her phone before she had thought to replace it, which had given him her location for the first 8 months after the divorce filing. They found on a hard drive in his Chicago office the specific combination of property tax records and email address matching that had led him to Kingsford, Wyoming. They found all of it. They found more than Marin had known to look for. In Kingsford, Orrin Pruitt drove to the hospital on the second day after Marin's rescue, carrying a tin of oatmeal cookies his wife had made, and moving with the unhurried dignity of a man who had decided a long time ago that the right thing to do was always worth doing slowly and correctly. He sat in the chair beside her bed while she ate two of the cookies with the careful attention of someone reintroducing solid food to a system that had been managing without it. "I knew you weren't just fixing a foundation," he said after a while. "I know you knew," she said. He nodded. He looked at his hands on his knees. "I should have checked on you earlier. When the storm hit and I didn't see your truck in town afterward, I should have made the call sooner." "You made it," Marin said. "That's what matters." He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who is not fully convinced by this absolution, but is willing to accept it from the person offering it. "Well," he said. He placed the tin on the bedside table. "My wife put extra cinnamon in those. She says it helps with the recovery from just about anything." "Tell her thank you," Marin said. He nodded once and stood and put on his hat. At the door, he paused. "You built something good out there," he said. "Structurally speaking." Marin looked at him. Something in her face shifted slightly toward the expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. "It held," she said. "It held," he agreed. And then he left. She was discharged from Kingsford County Hospital on day 12 of what she had begun privately to call the after. She had gained 4 pounds. Her blood work was trending toward normal. The doctors had expressed with professional restraint their considerable surprise at the overall condition of a person who had spent 89 days underground on 800 calories a day and had emerged ambulatory and coherent. She did not find it surprising. She had gone into the room with the intention of surviving, and she had built the room to make survival possible. And she had managed herself through the duration with the same methodical competence she brought to everything she built. The outcome was consistent with the inputs. It was not a miracle. It was engineering. She returned to Hollow Ridge Farm once before she left Wyoming. She drove out on a Saturday morning in the second week of March. The driveway had been plowed by the county equipment during the excavation and was navigable. The ruins of the farmhouse were still standing, barely the walls gray and waterlogged and stripped of most of their character by the smoke and the cold. The barn was gone, collapsed to a low mound of debris that the excavation had partially cleared and that the county had flagged for safety with orange tape. She stood at the edge of where the barn had been and looked at the concrete-edged rectangle that was still visible in the excavation the top of the room she had built. They had left it open for the investigation. She looked down into it from above for the first time since she had emerged from it, seeing it from outside, rather than inside, understanding its dimensions differently from this angle. It was small. This was what struck her. From inside, over 89 days, it had become the entire world. From outside, it was a small rectangular box in the ground, 12 feet by 10 feet. The floor still visible below the cot. Still on it, the empty shelves along the walls. She had lived in there. She had maintained in there. She had survived in there. She stood at the edge for a long time, looking down, letting the March wind move across the Bighorn foothills and across the ruins of Hollow Ridge Farm and across her face with the indifferent continuous energy of weather that does not distinguish between one year and the next, between a farm that is standing and a farm that has become something else. Then she turned her back on it and walked to her truck and drove to Kingsford and then south on the highway toward the rest of her life. She did not look in the rearview mirror. The sky above Wyoming was the particular blue of early spring, a blue so clean and deep it seemed structural rather than atmospheric, as though it were something built rather than something merely present. She drove under it with the window cracked, letting the cold air in, savoring the specific luxury of temperature, as a thing she could regulate simply by adjusting a window. She drove south. She had a name. She had her profession. She had the knowledge acquired at a cost she could not have fully predicted of what she was capable of when everything else had been taken up. She had the memory of 89 mornings in a row on which she had chosen with deliberate and specific intention to stay alive. She was Maren Voss, and she was going home.